Good morning. I'm going to try and say a few things today about self-worth or lack of self-worth, and along with that some things about guilt and purity. It's probably way too much to get into a short talk, but I'll just start off and see where we go. I think lack of self-worth is something which a lot of people experience. I seem to come across quite a few people who experience this, don't think much of themselves, even think they're a waste of space or they're not doing much that's of any value. And sometimes I experience this in myself. Well, I think it's quite deep in myself actually, to be honest. And I can trace it right back to my early years, to my upbringing. And well, that's where all of our difficulties come from, really, isn't it? It's from our early childhood conditioning. So the context I was brought up in was a Christian context, although I often wonder these days if that Christian context was actually a bit of a distortion of Christianity. It was a bit extreme in some ways because I was led to believe really that I wasn't worthy. So I didn't have any self-respect or self-worth. I heard the phrase miserable sinner quite often, as though we are all inherently sinners, inherently evil. That's a pretty dire message to be brought up with, I think. But whether or not that was a distortion of Christianity, that was my experience. I don't want to start blaming, where this came from, blaming who was responsible for this, because I think blame actually is a bit of a waste of energy, really. We live in a society where people get blamed an awful lot, far too much, I think. And I think it's a waste of energy and lacking in compassion, actually. But anyway, to come back to self-worth, when I came across Buddhism, and particularly when I came across Metta-bhavana and the first stage of the Metta-bhavana, I realised that actually I could develop some self-respect, some self-worth, even some self-love. Maybe there were aspects of myself that were much harder to bring into this arena. But I did get a sense that it was possible, and I did begin to experience myself, at least some of the time, in a more positive, self-respecting, self-worthy kind of way, without being weighed down by this guilt of thinking that I was a miserable sinner. And the other thing which was extremely important to me in terms of Buddhist practice was when I encountered the Buddha Vajrasattva, Buddha or Bodhisattva. Vajrasattva, the Vajra being, the adamantine being. There's an image of Vajrasattva, a completely white image, which actually is in front of me, so of course you can't see it. But the image behind me on the shelf there is also a Vajrasattva image, but not a white one. And discovering Vajrasattva and what Vajrasattva represented was such an enormous breakthrough, I suppose, for me. The essential message of Vajrasattva is one of purity. And it's a message of essential purity, that in our essence, whatever our essence is, in our essential nature we are pure. we're not adulterated, we're not impure, we're not stained. We're quite the opposite, really, of miserable sinners. We are, in fact, perfectly pure in our being. But to take on this message, or to fully understand it, to be able to perceive our essential purity, it does, of course, mean that we have to act ethically. Thinking of oneself as essentially pure doesn't mean, oh, I can do what I like because all my actions are essentially pure. Doesn't mean that. If we act unethically, in quite gross, unethical ways, then our perception becomes clouded. We don't have mindfulness, we don't have awareness. We don't have the light or the clarity of awareness to perceive the true nature of ourself. The true nature of reality, perhaps I should say, rather than self. Because if we're acting impurely, our minds are clouded. So we need to, first of all, act ethically. We need to follow the precepts. We need to do as much as we can in this area. In the threefold way of Buddhism, ethics is the first one. Ethics, meditation and wisdom. So we practice ethics, practice observing the precepts alongside our meditation practice and alongside our development of wisdom. When we recite the 5 precepts, or at least when we do the English version of the positive precepts, we talk about purifying our body, purifying our speech, purifying our mind. For example, with mindfulness clear and radiant, I purify my mind. So there's a direct connection there between ethical practice and purification. We're purifying ourselves on an ordinary level, I suppose you could say, a kind of mundane level. And that purification through practicing the precepts, through ethical life, brings about a purification of body, speech and mind. And when we do that, that means our mind is unclouded. It's light with awareness. It's bright. And then we can see into the nature of our mind, or into the nature of experience. When we do metabhavana practice that I referred to earlier, I talked about the first stage in developing self-worth, respect and love. But also, of course, we do that across the whole spectrum of living beings. So the metabhavana isn't at all a self-oriented practice. In fact, it moves, if we go deeply enough into it, it moves us away from just experiencing things from the point of view of self and towards experiencing things from the point of view of other. So we break down barriers between self and other. And breaking down these barriers is one of the ways into experiencing, how can I put it, let's say the open dimension of being. Now the open dimension of being was a phrase used by, I think it was Gunther who used this phrase, as a way of talking about shunyata, or emptiness. So emptiness doesn't mean nothingness, doesn't mean annihilation or nihilism. It is an open dimension of being. So there is still being, but it's in this particular dimension which is completely open. No boundaries of self, no boundaries of self and other. And this state of this open dimension of being, we could also say that it's a state of purity, complete purity. In our essence, we are pure and free. We don't need to be weighed down by guilt or unworthiness or lack of self-respect or lack of love. Not just lack of self-respect and self-worth, but also we develop love and respect for other beings, don't we? So it's not just about ourselves, but we experience it first of all and most strongly in ourselves. So the teaching of Vajrasattva, coming back to the figure of Vajrasattva, the teaching of Vajrasattva is that in our true nature, in our ultimate nature, we are essentially pure. But we only get to perceive that purity if we look to our actions of body, speech and mind and practice as skillfully as we can.